right, hello everybody. I'm Professor Jim Franklin from the Department of Politics and Government, and I'd like to welcome you all here to the John Kennard Eddy Memorial Lecture in World Politics. I'll tell you a little bit about the lectureship first. It was founded in memory of John Kennard Jeff Eddy, who was a politics and government major at Ohio Wesleyan in the late 1980s. Jeff had a keen interest in international affairs, and he and two classmates were on their way to a Russian studies seminar at Oberlin, I believe, when their car was struck by a reckless driver, killing them. His parents, John and the late Ellen Eddy, generously contributed the funds to make this lectureship possible. And we've had some of the top thinkers and scholars and people in government positions as part of this. It's been a fitting memorial to Jeff's interests and a gift that keeps giving to the OWU community and Delaware more generally. So it's been a wonderful legacy left in honor of Jeff Eddy. Okay, our speaker tonight, kind of fitting with the Russian Studies seminar I mentioned, is Professor Yoshiko Herrera. She earned a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth, a master's and Ph.D. from the University of Chicago. She served on the faculty at Harvard University and is now a professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's a leading expert on Russian and Eurasian politics, social identities, and political economy. I couldn't imagine a better speaker for this important topic tonight. She's published 3 books, over 30 articles and other chapters, has given invited talks at Harvard, Yale, Stanford, in London, Estonia, Russia. So we're very lucky to have her here tonight. So please welcome Professor Herrera.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, and what a pleasure to be here. Just thank you for perfect weather. Just a beautiful day today, walking around. Okay, this is a difficult topic, but I want to see if I can try to add a little bit of contextual understanding to everybody's thinking about this Russian war in Ukraine. And what I'm going to try to do tonight is, okay. I'm going to try to start with a little bit of discussion of where the war is at and the question of why the war started. That was, I think, once the invasion happened, the question that everybody was asking: why did Russia do this? What's the goals? Why is it going on? And then shift a little bit to what's happening within Russia and in Ukraine, and what I think is going to happen next. But let me start first with a couple of maps. Just want to make sure this mic, is it okay? Is it echoing? Okay, it's okay. Okay. Oh, this one? I just wonder if there's 2. Maybe that's a bit better. Is that better? Yeah, okay. Okay, so I want to start with some maps, because I think the map of Ukraine is actually important to some of the puzzles about the conflict. The first thing is that Ukraine is a very large country. It's the largest country in Europe. And if you see it in the context of Europe up there in the red, here is Ukraine transposed over the United States, and you see it goes from New York all the way to Illinois. And so it's a massive territory, 44 million people. And so, geographically, one thing that's important, let me just see if we have a, wait, is this a pointer? Oh yeah, here we are. Okay, very dim, but anyways. So it's a massive territory, but there is a river, the Dnieper River, that also divides the country. That's important geographically. It's important in terms of military and strategy. A lot of the fighting right now is centered around this bottom area in the city of Kherson. And so why I start with the size is that the idea that Russia is going to take over this country of 44 million people of such a size in just a couple of days without much preparation, really actually seems ridiculous. Unless you thought you had a population that's going to welcome you, which was the Russian view. But there's a lot of reasons why that also is sort of ridiculous, not least because of an important event in Ukrainian history is the Holodomor, which is understood by Ukrainians as a genocide against Ukrainians from the Soviet Union in 1932-33. So it's a very important event in Ukrainian national memory. And this is not something that people in Ukraine are going to have forgotten about. They're not going to forget about it. It's been widely discussed and talked about since Ukraine became an independent state in 1991. And so for Ukrainians, the idea that they would be subsumed by Russia, that they would no longer exist as a country, as a nation, is totally unacceptable. And so I think when you just take that small fact of the commitment by Ukrainians to their nation and to their sovereignty and the size and scale, you can see that this would have been a difficult prospect any way that you look at it. Okay, the second thing, let's see how we are working here. Okay, here we go. Second set of maps I want to just put up just in terms of pointing out where we are. So this is in the early days of the war, March 31st, a month into the war. Russians had captured a lot of territory, and if you recall, they initially were trying to capture Kiev. It would have been a very different war if Russia had been able to convince Zelensky in the early days of the war to just leave the country, go to Dubai, give up on things. That obviously did not happen, but I think the battle within Kiev and the fact that the Ukrainians were able to push Russia out of the capital and back towards the east, this is the current state of things, just changed the whole character of the war and turned it into much more of a battle. Still significant, maybe 15 to 20% of the territory of Ukraine, but most of Ukraine is not actively involved in the fighting, although many cities in Ukraine are subject to these missile strikes against civilian infrastructure and civilians that we've seen in the last couple weeks. So the state of the war is that Russia initially thought they would take over the country very quickly. It would just take a couple of days, not much preparation, and instead it's turned into a pretty serious war with massive losses on both sides. Estimates on the Russian side of up to 90,000 soldiers in these 8-ish months, which is, a tremendous number in historical comparative terms, and still a lot of fighting in these regions. Okay, so let's try to get into this analysis a little bit into why did Russia start this war. On the left, you have Prince Alexander Nevsky, a 13th century warrior, diplomat, first saint of the Russian Orthodox Church, and that's Putin on the right in his blanket and a hockey helmet. Okay, so the first point I want to make a few points about why did Russia start the war. This is something that every person who worked on Russia, I worked on Russia my entire academic career. I graduated from college in 1992, so while I was in college, I went to Eastern Europe. Actually, how I got interested in Russia is traveling to Eastern Europe in the spring of 1990, right after the Berlin Wall fell. And there was a lot of things going on. 1989 in Europe, 1991, end of the Soviet Union. And I got interested in Russian studies and what was happening in Russia because there were these, it was a momentous time. And I actually think we're in a similarly momentous event, sort of opposite negative reasons. But Russia, people who've been working in Russia for many years, I think very few people would have predicted that, not just predicted the start of the war, but the way that the war has transformed Russia and what's happened in Russia has been surprising. And so, but the big question, first of all, was why did Russia start the war? What were they hoping to gain? Okay, so the first point I want to make is about imperial international ambitions, and that is the idea that Russia never accepted the the sovereignty of the former Soviet states. That when the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, Putin particularly did not accept that those countries would have the right to choose their own destiny and be able to do what they wanted. Now, as long as those states sort of stuck with what Russia wanted, that was okay. But as I'm going to talk about a little bit later, the idea that these former Soviet states would be independent posed a big problem to Putin. And it's very clear that Putin was interested in expanding Russian power, and especially in terms of European security institutions. So I think at the international level, there's an interest by Putin to expand Russia's power, and in particular to deny the sovereignty of former Soviet states. But in addition, I think that we have to look within Russia at their understanding of national identity, and there's the concept of the Russian world and the idea of a Russian nation that is sort of global and fits in these different places, and including that is a denial of Ukrainian nationhood. So it's not just that Ukraine, the state, should not be able to make its own decisions, but the Ukrainian nation as a separate nation from Russia, I think, is also part of the denial on the part of Putin. Another thing is that there is a clear narrative of humiliation of the 1990s within Russia. This is something Putin has pressed over and over, that the 90s, they just say literally, Russia was on its knees. And especially following Crimea, one of the slogans was Russia is no longer on its knees. That the 90s and the breakup of the Soviet Union, the economic problems of the 90s were all a period of weakness, and this is a sort of shameful episode, but that Russia needs to sort of avenge the 1990s. NATO expansion, I would argue, is part of this symbolic weakness of Russia. It's absolutely not the case that NATO was ever planning to invade Russia from Ukraine. So this is part of the Putin propaganda, but there's no plan for NATO to invade Ukraine. And NATO did not pose a threat to Russia really at any point in the post-Cold War era in terms of threatening Russia's own sovereignty, et cetera. But NATO expansion is highly disliked in Russia by a lot of people. And one of the reasons is that the expansion of NATO, and especially the admission of the Baltic states into NATO, is symbolic of Russia's weakness and their inability to stop that process. So with Georgia and Ukraine, there is a document that says, from the NATO side, saying that Georgia and Ukraine will be part of NATO. They didn't say when, but they said they will be part of NATO, and that's from 2008. This document is something that the Russian side has opposed from the start, very agitated about the idea of Ukraine or Georgia or Belarus, any of these former Soviet states joining NATO. And again, that's because I don't think it's because of the strategic threat of NATO as much as the symbolic indication of Russia's weakness to stop a process that they don't like and to stop Russia from influencing its power abroad. And in addition, just following on this national identity theme, there's sort of an obsession with World War II in Russia under Putin. Now, World War II history is complicated, but Nazi Germany did attack the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union did fight as allies with the United States and Europeans against Nazi Germany. 25-ish million Soviet citizens are killed in World War II. So nobody really questions that the Soviet Union suffered a lot in World War II, nor that the Soviets were helpful in the fight against Nazi Germany. But the victory over the Nazis has become a literal obsession with the Putin regime, and the replaying of Soviet greatness has been a constant theme, especially in the later years. But something that I think is really a very important way to understand the Russian and Soviet version of Nazism is to understand that for them, the problem with the Nazis is that they attacked the Soviet Union. The Holocaust is a side story to Nazi Germany. That's not the main story. The main problem with Nazi Germany is that it attacked the Soviet Union, and hence Nazis are anti-Soviet. And in today's world, if you're anti-Russian, you're also a Nazi. And that's why you can call Ukrainians who are anti-Russian, you can call President Zelensky, who's Jewish, whose father fought in the Red Army, how can he be a Nazi? He's a Nazi because he's anti-Russian. And so this terminology of Nazism is associated with anti-Soviet or anti-Russian sentiment, not with hatred of Jews or the Holocaust, et cetera. I mean, obviously that's not the way other people see it, but that's part of the understanding of Russian national identity that Putin has focused on. Okay, a third factor is about Ukraine. Why Ukraine? You know, why attack Ukraine? Why not some of the other former Soviet states? Okay, Ukraine, first of all, in real, you know, even without interference too much from Russia, in fact, in Ukraine, there were pro-Russian and pro-Western people. There were people who thought Ukraine should take a more pro-West, this is pre-2014, people who thought Ukraine should join the EU, should move west, and there were people who thought, well, I speak Russian, I might be ethnic Russian, you know, Russia's fine, you know, we defeated the Nazis, okay? So, you know, Russia's not so bad. So there's back and forth in presidential races and also in other electoral politics, with more pro-Russia people on the east, more pro-Ukrainian people on the west. However, much of that changed over the course of post-1991 history because of a couple of things, and those are two social revolutions within Ukraine, one in 2004 and another in 2013, 2014. So 2004, Ukraine had a presidential election. Frontrunner Viktor Yushchenko was poisoned. We now understand, obviously, by Putin. It was just rumored to be Putin influenced, but now we understand Putin's his MO and how he works. And so very clearly, Yushchenko was poisoned by Putin. He was initially denied the presidency in favor of Viktor Yanukovych. After massive protests in the Orange Revolution, the court ruled in Yushchenko's favor. Yanukovych is out. For Russia, this Orange Revolution in 2004, some people have called it Russia's 9/11. And I think that is correct in the sense of the shock that it sent, because not only is Ukraine choosing the West, moving westward, but they are kicking out the Russian candidate, so through social protest. And if you're a dictator like Putin, the absolute last thing you want to see is a successful social revolution 2 times by people who are very similar to you. So Ukrainians and Russians have a lot of similarities. So when people in Russia see what's happening in Ukraine, they don't say like, well, I don't know, those people are so different from us, that would never happen here. Instead, you think, you know, it's kind of, being in the Midwest, you know, the Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, like you kind of say, well, it's kind of, I can see how something like that would happen, because there are rivals, but we can see that there's certain similarities. So the two revolutions, first in 2004, then Yanukovych comes back, winning election. He comes back and is president in 2013, when there's a lot of pressure on him to sign an association agreement with the EU. This is not joining the EU, but it's agreement moving towards greater trade and ties with the EU that he's supposed to sign in the fall of 2013. Under a lot of pressure from Putin, from the Russians, Yanukovych says, I'm not going to sign it. That leads to massive protests throughout the fall of 2013, the Euromaidan protests, which eventually lead to Yanukovych's ouster, second time he's kicked out. In January 2014, he flees to Russia. The United States is one of the first countries to recognize this new Ukrainian government, and that is the precipitating event for the 2014 invasion of Crimea. So for Russia, Ukraine is not just any country, it's a country that's kind of similar to Russia in various ways. In Putin's world, it's, you know, it's the same as Russia, it's the same nation. It's not the Ukrainian view. But the two social revolutions in Russia, combined with Ukraine's decision to reject Russian influence and move west, is especially dangerous to Putin. So these are, I think, some of the background things, but the other part of the puzzle is just the massive miscalculation. This is Putin meeting with his economic advisors right after the war started. he stopped doing this. I think that there was enough negative press of the long tables that he's recently stopped doing that. But it's actually very weird. Could be COVID related, could be he fears assassinations, who knows. But he's obviously not very close to those advisors. But what's the miscalculation? The first thing is he thinks that Ukrainians won't resist. And I think there's many reasons to think that's just idiotic, but if you take his worldview, his view of the Russian nation, his view of all the things that Russia deserves and what it should be doing in the world, and this dismissal of Ukrainians, disrespect for Ukrainians, his view that they wouldn't resist is not just a coincidence. It's part and parcel of his understanding of Russian national identity, I think. Second, Putin is buoyed by his previous experience where he thinks that he has gotten away various times with military activity that's been successful. So when he came to power, Russia had already had a war with Chechnya in 1994 to 1996. They lost in a humiliating defeat, somewhat similar actually to the initial losses in this war. Chechnya still was seeking independence, and when Putin came to power, one of the first things he did was restart a second Chechen war in a very similar way to what we're seeing now, which is the just decimation of the capital city Grozny, followed by massive bombing of civilian targets. But what's different in the Chechen war is he cut out all Western media. That Chechen war largely happened post 9/11. There's very little sympathy for an independent Muslim republic. The US was concerned with getting Russian support for the global war on terrorism, for Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. And so there just wasn't almost any international support for Chechnya. So Putin takes 9 years to wear down these very tough Chechen fighters, but they finally give up, and he installs an incredibly brutal dictator, Ramzan Kadyrov, there. Putin invaded Georgia in 2008. It's a little bit more complicated story, but it's a relatively successful military operation. The campaign in Syria, which again targeted civilians, targeted hospitals, used chemical weapons, et cetera. The chemical weapons were used in Syria and with Putin's support of Assad. And that was actually the first instance of Russian military operations outside the former Soviet space since 1991. But what was significant for Putin, I think, is that you can commit atrocities, war crimes, and nothing will happen to you. So these were much smaller operations in the war in Ukraine, but I think one of his takeaways from them was that there wasn't going to be much pushback from this Ukrainian war. He also expected, based on the 2014 experience, that sanctions against Russia would be relatively weak, and the scale and scope of the sanctions, I think, surprised everybody, including the Russian central bank, which thought we have all of these foreign reserves stored abroad, which we can access anytime, and it turns out that they're not able to do that. So the sanctions understanding was that Russia had built a sanction-proof economy by storing up all these foreign reserves, and that didn't turn out to be the case. You know, the US, if you haven't noticed, is actually a polarized, fairly polarized country with certain challenges that we're facing here, and especially with what has happened in the last few elections. One of the things that Putin has counted on is that Americans would not come together, that Democrats and Republicans would be divided on supporting Ukraine, on supporting Europe, on supporting NATO, and so he reasoned that the US wouldn't do very much, and that Europe and the world basically would not care. Finally, in terms of the media attention, I think it's my view that it's almost like a toddler where you put your hand up and you think that if you can't see them, they cannot see you. So his view is he's blocked all the foreign media within Russia. And so ordinary Russians are not getting the pictures of the atrocities and things like that. And he's not understanding that the rest of the world is seeing what's happening in Ukraine, is seeing the brutality of the Russian troops there. And he's not seeing it, and so he doesn't understand the effect that the media is having actually on this war. And it's very different from the Chechen case where media were largely blocked out. So I think that there are these background factors to explain the decision, including his ambitions, his way of understanding the world, the special status of Ukraine, but ultimately this is a massive miscalculation. I think within political science there's a lot, and within Russia, Ukraine experts, there's a lot of discussion of, is Putin rational? Was this a rational decision? I think it really strains the meaning of rationality to undertake something that is so unlikely to work out and is essentially destroying Russia as well as inflicting all this damage on Ukraine. So you could say, well, if you look at it from his perspective, it makes sense, but I think that there's no question to my mind that it's a number of serious mistakes in addition to just some wrong ways of looking at the world. Okay, so let me shift a little bit to what is happening within Ukraine and Russia since the war started. And within Ukraine, I think one of the really important things is there is a clear unity both at the mass and elite level in terms of support for the war effort and support for Zelensky. And why is this important? Well, when Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, the head of the Ukrainian Navy switched sides, switched over to Russia, took ships with him. There were massive defections in Russia in 2014 when Russia moved into Crimea. There were a number of pro-Russian people in the eastern part of the country who did not choose Ukraine. But what's happened since 2014 is there's been a lot of sorting. A lot of people who were pro-Russian have gone to the Russian side, and who's left in Ukraine are people who are very committed to the Ukrainian state, Ukrainian government, and Ukrainian nation. So the support for the Ukrainian government and for the war effort is very strong. So, you know, some military people talk about motivation and the will to win. I mean, you see that in sports analogies as well, but this is very clearly there on the Ukrainian side. Another important factor is that within the areas of Russian occupation on that eastern part of the country, unlike in 2014, as I mentioned, like some of the high-profile collaborators, the general collaboration strategy in Russia has not worked. So there's, I don't know if it's funny or not funny, but there's supposedly millions and millions of dollars from the successor to the KGB, the FSB, in Russia that was supposed to go to paying off low-level oligarchs in Ukraine to support the war effort, because Russia's going to move in there, they're going to hand out this money, people are going to say, that works for me, I'll take the money. Well, the money is gone. Now, where did the money go? Was it that these Ukrainian collaborators took the money and then just decided not to collaborate? Or was it that they never got the money in the first place? Maybe the FSB guys took the money themselves and just sent it to Bermuda or wherever they store their money these days, Cyprus, et cetera. So the money is gone. There haven't been many collaborators. But you can understand that if you're Ukrainian at this point and you were on the fence of thinking, which side should I be on? You can see that the worse Russia is doing, the much more dangerous it is for you to say you're going to support the Russian side. So I think that the early losses of Russia in the beginning of the war actually were very important for the failure of this collaboration strategy. But I think also the sorting post-2014 was important. The other thing I want to note is that a lot of people have left some of these areas that are occupied, but who doesn't leave? People don't leave who cannot leave. People who are not mobile, people who can't walk, people who need medical care. These are all people that are left living in those cities. And I mean, this is one of the real tragedies that you can see, same with hurricanes and things like that. You know, for some people it's easy to move around, but people who are poor or infirm, it's very hard to move. And those are the people suffering the most in these areas of occupation. Third point I want to make on this is that Russia, you know, it's clear from the news that Russia is targeting civilians, targeting infrastructure. But one of the things that you see a lot is, why isn't Ukraine, you know, I'm for peace. Like, why don't we just have a peace deal? Why don't we just say, like, who cares about territory? You know, let's just all live peacefully. So let's just let Russia have these 4 regions that they want, plus Crimea, and we'll have a ceasefire, and everything will be fine. The problem with that perspective is that what we see in the areas that Russia has occupied is we see evidence of atrocities and war crimes. So when you say, just leave it, that territory to Russia, just let it be, you are in some ways saying, let's just, knowing that we know there have been war crimes in the areas Russia has occupied, leaving those territories means leaving those people to whatever fate Russia brings them. So I think the atrocities and the war crimes are one of the reasons why it's not an easy ethical choice to just say, let's have a ceasefire and let Russia keep some of this territory. Okay, what else about Ukraine? The other thing I want to share with you about Ukraine is that if you look at the territory of Ukraine, it covers a lot of areas from different former empires. Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Lithuanian Duchy, the Russian Empire. There's different kinds of people there. Okay, those are all important. Ukraine has a variety of ethnic, linguistic, religious differences. But the important thing is, especially since 2014, many of those differences have been overshadowed by a renewed commitment to Ukrainian nation and sovereignty. So it's not that people don't care what their ethnicity is. It's not that they don't care if they're Ukrainian Orthodox Church or Russian Orthodox Church or something else. It's that they are putting aside some of these differences and putting their Ukrainian national identity first. And so this is a really important development that is it's not top secret. It's in public opinion polls. They measure ethnic linguistic differences over time in Ukraine. And it's very clear that since 2014, there's been a huge step up in nation building and national unity in Ukraine. And that's really important to the war. So what I have here on the left is a telegram message that Zelensky wrote, the so-called "without you" speech. This is when I don't want to say it's old, it's like a month now, of Russia bombing civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. So they bomb, they try to turn the lights out, and the idea behind this is to wear down the population. Well, one idea is mere punishment. If you think there's a strategic goal, the idea is to wear down the population, to have them think like, well, we're going to cut the gas off, you're going to freeze in the winter, we're going to turn the lights out, and so you better stop fighting or else this is what we're going to do to you. And Zelensky, he literally wrote this out, read my lips, without gas or without you, without you. Without light or without you, without you. Without water, without you, without you. In the Russian version, it's a little more lyrical because it's a common refrain. Like if you order a drink in a restaurant and they say you order sparkling water, they would say with gas or without gas, and you would just say without or with or whatever you want. So this with this or without that, it's a kind of common question, and then you can answer with or without. So this kind of refrain is sort of fits in with people's understanding. And I mean, this is Zelensky's own capitalizations, ending it without you. And this is something people understand. Like, they are not going to change their mind because the electricity is out. They're not going to change their mind because it's colder. They're going to put on more sweaters. They're going to live through it, and they're going to manage to preserve their nation and their state. So I think that's just one of the many examples going around in Ukraine. Okay, so what about Russia? What's happening inside of Russia? Well, unfortunately, Putin has ramped up the repression. He spent 22 years trying to stop people from collectively mobilizing against the regime. And in the last few years, he has increased the use of violence to do this, jailing, poisoning, killing his opponents. And at this point, he faces very little opposition. Almost no government ministers have resigned at all. One sort of washed up guy from the 90s, Anatoly Chubais, left the country quietly. One single diplomat from the foreign ministry has resigned. He recently wrote an article in the New Yorker about it. But these are very, very few officials. Opposition is in jail. Alexei Navalny, who was never like super popular in Russia, but he had some following. He's a real estate attorney who would popularize corruption among government elites. He has been harassed by the government repeatedly. He was put in jail for a while. He got out of jail. They put his brother in jail. Then they tried to poison him in 2020. He went back to Russia in 2021 and was jailed. He's in jail now, kind of facing solitary conditions. He's lost a lot of weight. He looks like a very scary, sad version of his former self. That's him when he was not so weakened by the jail time. But actually, just today, they're charging him with more anti-extremism crimes, because even from jail, the small number of things that he's said from jail, they're charging him with another crime while he's in jail. So the opposition and the context of fear has had a huge effect within Russia. The economy in Russia is suffering from sanctions, and they have to move towards a more autarkic, doing their own thing type of economy. That's the McDonald's being replaced by, they basically nationalized all the McDonald's restaurants, and they've replaced them with their own version. A lot of businesses have stopped doing business there. But they present it to the population that it's a temporary thing. It just, like for a little while, things will be bad, but then things will go back to normal. And I think that that strategy has its limits. You know, how long can you tell people things will go back to normal before they actually expect them to go back to normal? And the big thing that is threatening the regime, I think, at the moment is the so-called partial mobilization, where they actually don't call this a war in Russia. They call it a special military operation. And they've said all along, everything's going totally fine, and you know, we have everything we need, we don't need anything else. But oh, by the way, now suddenly we need to mobilize people for this war. And that has led to hundreds of thousands of people leaving the country, going into other former Soviet states or to other parts of the world. And so this is just a massive brain drain that started at the beginning of the war that's exacerbated now by men of military age leaving the country. Okay, but this gets to a question which is about, do the Russians support the war? Okay, and this is something for people studying Russia, it's a very touchy question, because a lot of people are very anti-Russian right now who look at this and they say, okay, this isn't so clear, but these are public opinion polls from March 2022 down to August 2022. If you combine the definitely yes, which is the gray bar, with the yes, the first blue bar, you get around 75-ish% of people saying they support the actions of the Russian military forces in Ukraine. Notice they don't say, do you support the war? Because you're not allowed to say it's a war. That's a punishable offense to call it a war. So they say, do you support the actions of the Russian military? So 76% yes or definitely yes as of August. That makes them sound like what horrible people these Russians are, that they're supporting this terrible war. How can they support that when they see these atrocities, et cetera? So my response to this is that most of these polls, including Levada, used to say what the non-response rate was. They no longer report the non-response rate. In the polls that do report it, it's at least 95%. Okay? So, and they do, let's say, 26,000 people poll, and 95% of them don't answer. I can tell you, if I were in Russia right now and somebody called, I would not even say, I'm not answering. I would just say, what? Hello? I can't hear you? Because I wouldn't even want to say, I'm not answering. I would just hang up and pretend like the phone dropped or something. Because if I was going to go against the Putin regime, why would I do it for a pollster? I mean, I would be thinking, what's my strategy? What am I going to do here? And it's not going to be to answer this poll. So what we know about these people who are answering is that they're very likely to be Putin supporters. That's who answered. Because if you're a regime supporter, then what do you have to worry about, right? And there's some evidence for this in the following, which is that there's a lot of evidence that these people who are saying definitely yes or yes that they support the war are actually supporting Putin rather than a specific policy. For example, a recent poll from September 29th to October 1st by a company called Russian Field, they asked, would you support Putin if he launches a new attack on Kiev? 60% said yes. But 75% said they would support Putin if he stops the war right now, right? Absolutely contradictory positions. But if your position is, whatever Putin says, I'm for it, then it doesn't matter. Whatever he's going to do, you're for it. So my view is that what these polls are capturing is actually support for Putin among those people who are already supporters of Putin, not really anything else. So what do we know? Like, for sure, there are Putin supporters in the country. I'm not saying there are not Putin supporters. But we don't know what the extent of true support for the war or opposition to the war is because it is so dangerous to speak out against the regime. And you have to think about what your options are, I think, if you're going to do that. Okay, so just to wrap up, how will it end? These are sometimes in political science we don't predict enough because we don't want to be wrong. But I've already been wrong about this war in that I did not think, if you look at my interviews, can't hide it, that I thought up until the very end Putin would not invade because I thought Ukraine would win and it would just be crazy. Ukrainians would fight for years in an insurgency if necessary to stop this. And I thought that up until February 24th, Putin had everything he wanted. He had the whole world talking to him. He had every foreign minister going to him saying, like, what can we do for you to get you to not do this? And he could have amassed his troops and said, okay, we want Donetsk and Luhansk finally settled via the Minsk treaties. We want to keep Crimea. We want the sanctions from 2014 cut off. He could have made a lot of demands, and Ukraine was not going to join NATO on February 23rd of 2022. So he could have gotten a lot, but he didn't. So I was wrong about that invasion. I thought it was a crazy thing to do. But this is what I think is likely to happen. So as I said, Ukraine remains quite united. I think we're going to see more violence by Russia because that's pretty much what they have. I mean, they've clearly shifted to not even trying to win the war militarily, but just to punishing Ukrainian civilians. I think there's going to be more military support for Ukraine, especially the more civilian victims Russia pursues. And I think Ukraine is eventually going to join the EU. Not necessarily NATO, but I think they are going to join the EU, but it's going to be at great cost. Because, I tell students in a class I'm teaching, when you think about the costs of war, I mean, students aren't the greatest example for this because they're not homeowners doing a renovation. But if anybody's ever tried to renovate some part of your house, even a small thing, a bathroom, it's very expensive. And think of how many buildings have been destroyed in Russia. Think of anybody who's voted for a school bill to build a new high school or a new elementary school, how expensive it is. How expensive it is to build new highways. Like, Ukraine is just being pummeled, and somebody is going to have to rebuild that. So the costs to Ukrainian economy are very high. The costs in terms of the trauma from the war are very high. So I don't want to make it sound like everything's going to be rosy, but you can see a path for Ukraine when this war ends to rebuilding and to eventually having a normal country. On Russian side, I don't see such a clear path. I don't think Putin will stop until he's defeated militarily. People said at the beginning of the war, which I think is still true, that Putin will stop when he is stopped. So he's not going to, in my opinion, he's not going to say like, oh, never mind, I'm just giving up on the whole thing. He's not going to see the light and say like, oh, these war crimes are so terrible, what a sad loss of life it is, I'm going to stop. I think he's going to have to be stopped. The sanctions are going to continue to degrade the Russian economy, and despite the propaganda coming out of Russia, Russia's economy is going to be severely damaged by the sanctions and by the cutoff of global trade for years to come. And even though they're kind of relying on China to some extent, people in China are actively watching this war. They have their own problems there. They have their own economic problems. And the more they see Russia losing, the less it makes sense for them to tie their fate to Putin. And unfortunately, I just think the domestic opposition to Putin is very, very limited, but I also think we don't really know the true extent of discontent because it's very hard to measure. So the most optimistic scenario to me for Russia is a kind of now out of nowhere scenario where you have a sudden collapse of the regime and kind of cascade that's somewhat unexpected because people are not going to put their cards on the table and announce, like, here's how many of us disagree with the regime. It's going to be a scenario where suddenly there looks like an opening and people take it if such an opening arose. But it's going to be very hard to predict when that might happen. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And so let's now have some time for some questions for Professor Herrera.
Given what Silvio Berlusconi was quoted as saying today and some of the other things that are going on with the energy issues in the rest of Europe, how strong do you think Europe's support is for Ukraine, and how will a bad winter affect that support?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, Europeans are the ones that are really facing the costs of the sanctions, and one of the important aspects of the sanctions is that the big loophole in them is the energy sanctions, the oil and gas purchases from Russia, much of which is coming from Europe. So it's easy to say, like, just stop buying oil and gas, but when it's 30 or 40% of your energy supply, that's a massive, it's not just massive, it's impossible to maintain an economy in those conditions. So it's very hard to say. I mean, some European countries like Poland, they're going to just live with it. The Baltic states, they've already had this experience. It doesn't matter. I think Germany, France, Italy are more. It's less clear. And with elections and different governments in Europe, the support for Ukraine and the support for energy sanctions is more unstable. So unfortunately, I don't know what's the answer to that. But it depends on the way that Europeans see this and how much they see what's happening in Ukraine as potentially spilling over into Europe.
Hi, this is a question about Navalny. He was the one who had the white T-shirt, Abercrombie and Fitch. Anyway, he had been in prison, and then I believe he was released. And he was living freely, I'm not sure, it was out of Russia.
Yes. Well, he never left. He left Russia for times, but he was living freely. He was in prison. He got out of prison. He was still living in Russia. He got to run for mayor of Moscow, which he lost.
Okay. And then, but the last time, when he was living freely, he, of his own free will, I believe, went back.
Yes.
And then was re-imprisoned. Why did he go back?
Yes. Yeah, this is kind of an amazing story. It's after he was poisoned and flown to Germany, then he was kind of rehabilitated in Germany. And the Putin regime would like nothing better for him and all the other opposition to just leave the country and delegitimate themselves as Russian opposition by leaving the country, because they say, like, look at this guy living in Paris or Austria or whatever, just he doesn't care about you, he's not a real representative of Russia. So Navalny, his own statements were that he's not going to live out of Russia, he's going to go back to Russia and he's going to demand that there be democracy and accountability and a reduction of corruption in Russia. So he went back and he's immediately arrested. I mean, it's just an act, I think, of bravery, and he just would tell people, like, please, like, they can't arrest all of us. Like, just go and do something. Don't just live in fear. But obviously, a lot of people, they're not willing to go to jail or be killed in jail or poisoned, et cetera. So, yeah, it's a question. He could have been living and alive if he had stayed out of Russia.
What do you think the likelihood or the feasibility of Mr. Putin having previously unexpected or unforeseen serious health problems?
Well, we don't know what Putin's health situation is. You know, maybe he's fine, maybe he has cancer, maybe he has who knows what. He does things occasionally that are strange and everybody says like, oh, that's it, he has Parkinson's, or oh, you see, he has cancer. We don't really know the state of his health. He's just turned 70 by many standards, not old. But for him, he doesn't seem as active as he used to be. So it's hard to say. But could somebody assassinate him? People would like to, a lot of people would like to. A lot of people would just like, they don't even go so far. They just say, wouldn't it be great if he just died? Or if somebody could, if somehow there were a regime change, many people think that would be good for Russia. But I don't know, because he is very reclusive, he's very untrusting. So with those long tables, et cetera, the chance of people being very close to him, he's built his regime on getting rid of anybody who's disloyal and surrounding himself only with loyalists. So it's hard to see one of those people turning on him.
One more here, and then I'm going to go to the back.
Do you have any comments about the obvious traditional barbarity traditions of the Russian military seen in being over the centuries?
Yeah, this is a question about. It's a question I have, you know, for some of my colleagues who study political violence. Like, what explains atrocities? Like, even in this case, even if we didn't say, well, what about all the other barbarity? Why did they do this? What explains Bucha? What is going on there? What we can say is Bucha is not one single case. So there's many cases of it which suggest that it's some kind of part of the military culture, or it is specifically allowed or authorized, et cetera. So it's not a case of like, mostly they're fine and then there's this one bad apple. So I think there's a fair amount of evidence that if this isn't an official policy, it's at least something that is not disallowed, and that it's not uncommon. So there is a pattern to explain there, and yeah, what explains it? Why is that happening? I'm not a military historian or specialist in military culture, but certainly there are norms of behavior, and I think one of the things that's interesting is some people will say to me like, well, what about Abu Ghraib? What about what Americans did in Vietnam or in Iraq, et cetera? And my response is that I'm not going to defend every US policy, but I would say in the face of war crimes, our government typically investigates them. We don't just watch a policy like this unfold, and it's not our official policy to say, A, it didn't happen, B, if it did happen, they did it to themselves. I mean, that's the Putin response to Bucha, is that these are fake pictures, and when you see these massacres, it's the Ukrainians who massacred themselves. So I think that's something that distinguishes a lot of democratic governments from the Putin regime in the face of atrocities. Not to say that no democracy ever has military that commits atrocities, but the way that we handle it is much different, we handle it differently. So I think it's a complex question of why atrocities, what's the strategic value of them, to what extent are they commanded from above, but I don't really know the answer. And I think looking back culturally at the value of human life, I mean, from Putin, one of the first things he did when he got into office is he oversaw this sinking of the Kursk submarine, where there were sailors on board who were alive, who needed assistance, and Norway offered it, and he refused to allow Norway to go and save those sailors on the submarine, and they all died. And Putin's response was like, yeah, well, you know, the submarine sank. And so that's almost one of the first things that he did when he became president, and it's indicative of his general disinterest in human life. or the value of human life. So I think from the top, you do not have a humanitarian by any means there. But how far that goes in terms of other Russian culture, I don't know.
50% of Russia's economy is invested into energy, and about half of that is sold to Europe. Russia's military, it's mostly like Soviet equipment, and I heard even in Georgia that officers in the Russian military had to resort to using their mobile phones because their communication systems were so old. Do you think with the events in Ukraine that Russia could lose its status as even a regional power? Because I think with the events they've lost their status as a world power.
Well, many people are reassessing the capacity of the Russian military in light of this event. In terms of its regional power, there is an organization, CSTO, which is supposed to protect certain countries. It's kind of like the counter to NATO, and Armenia is a member of that. Azerbaijan, in the context of this conflict, started bombing Armenia, and Russia did nothing to protect Armenia. So that's a pretty big indicator that, in terms of fulfilling its military commitments in the region to its supposed military partners, it's not able to do that. I think that the meetings that you've seen recently with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and others, they all suggest that there is a lot of nervousness and unease about what Russia's doing in Ukraine, and that Central Asia and countries in the Caucasus are not willing to just support Russia. So yes, everybody is reassessing Russian military. Yes, there's a ton of corruption, and the communications breakdown, including use of personal cell phones, which are interceptable by the Ukrainians, is a huge problem for Russian logistics. But what Russia has, what we haven't mentioned so far, is the nuclear weapons. And so that's, I think, what's distinguishing Russia from being just, another corrupt authoritarian country.
So basically, if Russia occupied a part of Ukraine by the time the war ends, what do you think will be the effect on other neighboring countries like Georgia, Tajik, and others?
If Russia's allowed to keep the territory?
Yep, if it does, like China and Hong Kong.
Well, I mean, it's a really interesting question. What exactly is the lesson that China is drawing from this experience with regard to Taiwan in particular? I mean, China already pretty much controls Hong Kong, but what about Taiwan? And I think that given the already precarious state of the Chinese economy, they can't be sure, especially on the sanctions front, that if they were to invade Taiwan, that they wouldn't face a similar sort of economic pushback. People used to think that economic interdependence prevented war. Russia sells gas and oil to Europe. Europe needs that gas and oil, and therefore everybody is going to play nice because we need each other. China sells a lot of things to the world, but they depend on that money for their economy, and so because of the interdependence of global trade, China won't do anything too bad. Well, they put 1 million Uyghurs in prison and got away with it. So I think that the idea that interdependence per se stops you from going to war, that argument is kind of suspect. But what lesson exactly is China drawing? It could be that they're drawing the lesson, we better not attack Taiwan because there could be a serious coordinated international response. Could be a lesson that they draw like, wow, the world is totally focused on Ukraine right now. Maybe they wouldn't be so able to stop us from military action in Taiwan. So that's an alternative scenario. I think if Russia merely controls some territory, well, I say merely, that is, if there's some sort of end to the war and they keep some territory, say Crimea, I'm not sure other countries would necessarily focus on that as the lesson. I think what will matter is like what happens to Ukraine after that, what happens to Russia after that. So I think what's the aftermath of the war, countries may focus on. But I think that there's still room for ramping up additional sanctions, secondary sanctions on Russia, which which I think should be done. And in that case, that's going to draw China in further to have to make a decision about whether to continue its lukewarm support for Russia or to really cut ties and abide by new sanctions.
What are your thoughts on the official integration of the LPR and DPR into the greater Russian nation and its effects on the war effort?
Oh, I think this is just total propaganda. I mean, there's an ongoing war. They don't control all of the territory that they supposedly annexed. Even the Putin press secretary, Peskov, when asked last week, like, where exactly is the border of Russia, he said, we'll get back to you. Because Kherson is supposed to be part of their territory. So, I mean, the strange thing is that in Donetsk and Luhansk, there was some support for Russia. I mean, it was an ongoing war since 2014 because it wasn't that the Ukrainians were so able to control that territory or everybody there was pro-Ukrainian. So there was some pro-Russian support. But since the war started, I think a lot of the dynamics have changed. Like I would say, even for myself, if you asked me 1 year ago, is Crimea ever going to be returned to Ukraine? I would have said, no, I don't think so. Just seems like that is not going to happen. And now I think it's likely it will be returned because I don't think Ukraine is going to be willing to stop until they get all of the territory back.
Okay, yeah, definitely there is a lot of moral condemnation against Russia because Russia violated international rules and the state sovereignty of Ukraine. But from the perspective of power politics, it's all about chess game. It's not just war between Ukraine and Russia because the US and West is deeply involved. But some realists in the US, they also claim that US also has had some responsibility at least because they have to prepare it for the rise of China, but have isolated, antagonized Russia. So what do you think about this argument? Secondly, another big problem is the possibility of the use of technical, the nuclear weapons by Russia. The possibility is low, but what should be the US response if Russia made a decision to use nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons?
Okay, you asked, I feel, one easy question and one hard question. The first question, is it the West's fault? John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago, he literally wrote an article in 2014 saying why the Ukraine crisis is all the West's fault. I think in 2014, you could discuss what things went wrong in international relations that led to antagonism between Russia and NATO. NATO expansion is clearly something that people in Russia are really mad about. But you know, something we don't talk about that much is they're like really mad about Kosovo, still really mad about Kosovo. They're really mad about Libya. Like these don't even measure up for us, but they're really mad about Kosovo, really mad about Libya. So there are various things that they object to in terms of US unilateral action militarily around the world that you could say, okay, the US is actually projecting power, doing various things, much of it connected to the global war on terrorism, but also supportive Arab Spring and regime change in different places. And Russia did not like that. And in 2014, they kind of really put their foot down and say, we told you so many times, we're really mad, and now we're telling you we're just taking Ukraine. I think there's a certain distance you can go with that argument. But within Russia, there's a lot of domestic developments, including the rise of authoritarianism and then just this completely violence-based dictatorship that you have now that has basically nothing to do with the West. And this is about the development of this personalistic dictator who is detached from reality and has these crazy views about the world. And there's no way any of that is the West's fault. Similarly, the idea that Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, et cetera, all the former Soviet states, do not have a right, A, to be a state or be a nation or make decisions separate from Russia is not legitimate. I mean, that's a view that Putin holds, and it's wrong, and this is not the West's fault. So his view that Ukraine should not be allowed to join Europe or the EU is his view, and it is not the West's fault. So I think, yes, they're mad about NATO expansion, but NATO expansion is not the only thing that has happened. There's a lot of things that led into this war. And so I think at this point, also seeing the civilian atrocities, the war crimes, I mean, I find it just amazing. I mean, I'm a former graduate student from University of Chicago, so I know John Mearsheimer to some extent. I just find it amazing that in the face of this war criminal action and atrocities, you do not say, okay, I'm going to stop blaming America and start saying this is Putin's responsibility. I mean, this is, to me, kind of irresponsible at this point. Even though I would have been willing to have an intellectual debate up to 2014 about why relations with Russia kind of went off the rails. Okay, that was the easy question. The hard question on what's the nuclear response, I think that there is a threat of use of nuclear weapons by Russia because they're running out of other options militarily. And I think that they may use nuclear weapons for two reasons. One, as a last-ditch effort to win, but then they would be putting a nuclear bomb in territory they supposedly want. But the second is purely punitive. Maybe they're losing, and on their way out, they just want to punish more Ukrainians. I think this is a fundamental guiding concern of NATO and of the United States, and why NATO and the United States did not get involved from the start. Why did we restrict our involvement to sending arms to Ukraine in this small way, or piecemeal way? And the reason, in my opinion, is that the Biden administration and NATO have forefront in their mind preventing World War III and saying, we're going to go up to the limit of supporting Ukraine, but not engage in a direct NATO-Russia confrontation, which literally would be World War III. So when people have slogans like protect the skies of Ukraine, okay, protect the skies means NATO should shoot down Russian planes. That's what it means. NATO should go into Russia and shoot at Russian targets to stop Russian targets from going into Ukraine. That is a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia, and that is extremely escalatory. So I think, again, like, it's not an easy choice, because when you say, no, I'm not in favor of protecting the skies, I'm not in favor of a direct Russia-NATO confrontation, you're also saying, I'm willing to sit here and watch civilians be killed by Russian actions. So it's not that I would say it easily, but I would say it's a danger or fear of nuclear escalation and literally World War III that is keeping NATO and the United States from direct engagement with Ukraine. But I actually think that is probably a responsible policy, although I'm sorry to Ukrainians that don't agree with that, but I think that that's my opinion, is that there is a view of escalation, and that's what is guiding the US and NATO policy so far.
Any other questions?
I wondered if you could touch a little bit on the idea of domestic opposition to Putin. Do you see anything from the history of, like, looking back maybe to the 70s to now in terms of any hope for that? Do you think, obviously he's oppressive and that's a big factor, but are there any other factors that might give you hope for that or insights?
Yeah, sadly, there's, like, you look back and you think, oh, but then there was this, or then there was something else. Like in the Soviet Union, there was collective leadership in the Politburo, for example. So Gorbachev was the general secretary of the Communist Party, and there were other people who could potentially act collectively to stop him. I mean, there was actually an attempted coup in August 1991. I don't think there's any collective leadership in the Putin regime. So in terms of elites working together, I don't see much of that. I think going from Stalin to Khrushchev to Brezhnev, you see that there is a gradual easing and lower use of violence. The number of people jailed, for example, going from Stalin to Khrushchev to Brezhnev goes down. And so by the time you get to Gorbachev, there's many fewer people in jail, and the regime is not relying as much on physical repression to stay in power. With Putin, the repression is going up. So he's not relaxing. The work against any kind of collective action, forming parties, communicating, people working together in any small way against the regime is very, very difficult. So it's hard exactly to see that. But then I think, well, okay, maybe we don't know everything. Maybe there will be, for example, there's a lot of Telegram channels. There's different kinds of technology that an older person like myself doesn't even understand. And there could be different ways that people organize under the radar that that the regime is not totally on top of. They've also just sent hundreds of thousands of people outside of the country who theoretically could come back into the country in different ways. I think the mobilization is really straining the regime because people were thinking this war was going to be costless for us, and now it doesn't look like it. So I think, yeah, okay, there's potential for some kind of technological innovation that we don't know about that would allow people to communicate and work together collectively. It's possible the mobilization will spur more opposition to the regime. The only hopeful thing I could concretely point to is the fact that there have been times when the regime has come up against the limits of society. Most recently in the COVID vaccine episode. Russia developed its own vaccine, the Sputnik vaccine, and only about 10 or 15% of the population was willing to get vaccinated. And that's largely because they did not trust the government. They did not know what's in it. I mean, obviously we have some vaccine hesitancy in this country too, but for different reasons. There, people just said, we're not going to do it because we don't trust the government. And the government, recognizing that, did not press people to get vaccinated. They just said, okay, well, we have this vaccine. If people want it, they should get it. But they didn't make a concerted effort to force the population to get vaccinated. And I think that's one of the indications that you can see that the government is not all powerful. They still are capable, they're capable of doing certain things, but in terms of getting people to actively do what they want, which is what they need to do for mobilization, for example, they see some of the limits to that. Because just to give you an example, for voting, they've made it so that the individual doesn't matter with voting. Like, you want to vote in an election? Well, first of all, we control who the candidates are. We control what the vote counts are. We add votes, we fake numbers, we do whatever. So you can go and vote, but your vote doesn't matter. Whoever you vote for doesn't matter, and just your input into this process is zero. And we want you to know that. So the whole policy is to say, as an individual, you have no power, there's nothing you can do that matters. Mobilization totally turns that around and says, you must move your physical body to this office, and then you go to this place to be trained, and you need to do these things. And we can lie about it and say how many people signed up, but that doesn't actually get troops into Ukraine. So mobilization actually puts power right back in the individual, and people have the ability to leave the country, to go hide out at the dacha, or to show up, or to get fined if they don't show up. But the mobilization is actually requiring active participation by the population, and the regime doesn't really have the power to compel that. So I guess that's like one little glimmer of hope, is that I don't think the regime is able to compel the population to positively do things, although they are in many ways able to stop people from acting collectively.
I think we have time maybe for one more question, if anybody has another question.
Hello. So we know that White House statement was that if Russia uses nuclear weapon in Ukraine, they won't respond in a nuclear way, but the consequences will be severe for Russia. And then the ex-CIA director in his interview says that if Russia uses nuclear weapon, US would destroy all Russian assets and military forces in Ukraine, meaning that US and NATO should set their force, their troops there. Do you think the nuclear weapon usage in Ukraine by Russia can be the red line when the NATO intervenes and starts the war?
Okay, so I'm going to respectfully disagree a little bit with the White House statement, because I think that the White House statement was more along the lines of, if Russia uses a nuclear, unless something happened today, because I've been busy today, but with meetings here, but I think their general point has been, if Russia uses a nuclear weapon, we're going to do something really, really big, so watch out. But we're not telling you yet what it is. I think the correct approach has been to be kind of cagey about it. And sure, there's some people, like I think I saw David Petraeus on TV saying there's going to be a massive conventional response. If you think about the response to nuclear weapons as being either respond with nuclear weapons, respond with massive conventional force, which could then result in further nuclear strikes, strategic nuclear strikes on Europe or the US, which would then compel a US response, or people say do nothing, I would say I think the response of a nuclear strike, option one, is low. Because why would you do that? Like, we don't want to get into a nuclear war as the first sign of things. It doesn't make any sense. Why would we do that? Because even if you thought the option two, conventional response, would lead to nuclear escalation, why would you start with the escalation? So I seriously doubt the US response to a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine would be use of nuclear weapons. Some people have suggested, why don't we give tactical nuclear weapons to Ukraine and let them deal with it, and this would kind of take us out of it. Some people think that's idiotic, that would just be seen as escalatory and the same as nuclear use. So I don't think option one of response with nuclear weapons is likely. I think the conventional response is possible, but maybe not. And the third option of doing nothing, I think, okay, just stay with me for a moment. You might think this is the worst possible thing to do nothing, but there is what we consider a nuclear taboo against first strike use of nuclear weapons. Almost everybody agrees with this. There's only 9 countries in the world that have nuclear weapons. All the other countries do not have nuclear weapons. All those other countries are signatories of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. There's a lot of countries that are against nuclear weapons, the existence of nuclear weapons and the use of nuclear weapons. There's countries that aren't currently so engaged in this war who might say, we don't want any use of nuclear weapons, and we're going to, if we have uncertainty about sanctions and about like whether to punish Russia or not, if Russia were to use a nuclear weapon, all of that uncertainty goes away. So the Russian use of nuclear weapons is going to be, if Russia isn't already a pariah state, it is going to escalate Russia's status as a pariah state. So why would the US just let that disappear by getting into nuclear use itself? I think that there is at least a chance that NATO, the US, tries to make some kind of big deal out of the fact that Russia used nuclear weapons before something else. Now that may be just like totally unrealistic and they're just going to respond conventionally in a massive way, and so all the peacenik talk doesn't matter. But I do think there is going to be a moral condemnation further of Russia if they did use nuclear weapons. So I don't think that, I do not think the US is going to react immediately in that way.
All right, well, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming here. Thank you, Dr. Herrera.